Shawn Bryant. I'm so glad that he's with us today, and he's a friend and a colleague, and we're just so delighted to have him here today. He's a former Head Start teacher, a mental health consultant, and is the founding director of Teaching Excellence Center. He has over 27 years of educational experience in urban, suburban, and rural school district and early learning settings. Much of Shawn's work supports teachers, programs, and leaders in planning, visioning, implementing, and evaluating large-scale improvement initiatives. He is a national speaker, trainer, and consultant, and you can learn more about Shawn by visiting his website, www.teachingexcellencecenter.com. Thank you, Shawn, so much for being here today and sharing this training with us, and welcome, and thank you for putting together this panel. And I'll be happy to support the chat box as we go along with the training today. Take it away, Shawn.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another full session of Learning with Training at First Five. I want to send a special thank you to Beth and Leah, and to Leah for a virtual hug, for all the emails, all the questions, and your responsiveness during this entire process. So as Beth said, this session is addressing elephants in the room, equity and racism. So we've broken it up. Today we're going to be doing some stuff around equity, and the next Thursday it will be Elephants in the Room Part 2, racism. So again, good morning and hello to everyone. Thank you for deciding to spend time with us today. We value your time and attention. So as Beth said, I'm Shawn Bryant. I've been in early childhood and education for 27 years now. As she said, I'm the founding director of Teaching Excellence Center. You can find me on social media. I won't spend a lot of time on that. We have been doing this tender and tough topic virtual sessions. The sessions you see here with the red stars, we've already presented, and we're looking forward to doing more of these sessions throughout the coming program year, with some with First Five and some with other agencies like Resource and Referrals. We're really excited about next month. We're doing a 4-part Playing a Trauma Responsive Way, What Adults Can Do session, virtually hosted by First Five. And this session was originally scheduled for March, but thanks to COVID, everything got shifted around. It was going to be a full day in-person session, but we've been able to work some things out to make it an awesome experience through a virtual learning. So today, like I said, we're going to do addressing the elephants in the room, and our presenters are going to be Dr. Patricia Nunley, Zelica Rodriguez-Deams, and Tarah Fleming, who are going to come and hone in on some specific issues and challenges and ways that you can elevate yourself and help others around equity in terms of these big ideas in action. It's not just going to be a jargon-filled presentation, but keep in mind that we're learning from each other and with each other, and we need to be open what it's like to hear from other people who are weathering this storm. We find that when we check in early and often, that's a strategy, and that as you hear some things that may be familiar, that may be brand new to you about equity, consider how you can weave those things into your existing programs and practices, because we find that when we can pull these strategies into what we're already doing with ourselves individually, if we're doing reflective work, with our family, our colleagues, or people we work with or possibly work for, that's the strength of this work. So a lot of us are doing good and effective work, but we seem to get lost when it comes to issues around equity and liberation across all fields in terms of being individuals and in communities. So think about that in terms of how can you take this back for yourself, your clients, your colleagues, and your community. Because largely we created this because we know that people are tired of suffering. So see this as a response to long-term and ongoing suffering. So just some things we want to highlight today. We're going to raise awareness for many people around these issues, and we're going to learn some new skills. We can't do some hands-on stuff or practice new skills. We could, but With 3 people speaking, the time won't allow for that. So we're gonna raise awareness and learn some new skills. I wanna encourage everybody to pull out a paper or pencil right now and consider these thinking stems. So throughout the presentation, as you're activating your thinking stems, jot down these stems and kind of complete the sentence as the just beginning process for your learning. I'm thinking, I'm wondering, I'm noticing, it reminds me of, I'm figuring out, I just learned. And you can add your own thinking stems, but what we find is when we activate our thinking stems, it helps us to go back to have a starting place when we're learning as adults. So some disclaimers for today. Today's webinar is an introduction to these themes surrounding equity and anti-Blackness. Today's session will not in no way make you an expert. Today's session is about anti-oppression, anti-Blackness, anti-hate, and liberation work as a continuous and ongoing process. This work is interdependent, it's interconnected and woven together, and it's intersectional. And you're gonna hear some of the presenters talk about that. Information presented will be at sometimes early childhood specific, and at other times it won't be early childhood specific. However, it will be cross-cutting. So regardless of who you are or how you interwork, you'll find something that you can chew on and take away and apply it to your life and work. And just need to make a full disclaimer. These sessions today and next week are not about white guilt, white shame, blame, or fragility. This is about elevation of everybody to do the work surrounding this and surrounding our hard history and having the courage to face our hard history and the courage to face our unknown future together. So as we begin, I want to offer everyone up Beth. Beth has become a friend of mine. So if you may have some feelings or emotions, I want to offer you Beth. Take some belly breaths, consider your emotions, your thoughts, and your helpful response for yourself and for others as just a strategy to help you monitor yourself throughout this learning, which can probably bring up feelings and emotions for lots of folk. All right, so I'm actually really excited in a weird way that it was the onset of COVID, I believe, that really allowed us to interrogate our approaches around systems and existing structures. And it was because of COVID that what we really saw was lots of younger Americans who left college and were unemployed or at home working. They were activating what we call solidarity in the face of our modern society. So they decided to act on things that their parents and grandparents had never acted on in this way. And they started as individuals and we're slowly moving into organizational structures. And some things have come out of that. Some clear questions that we have to ask ourselves. Who are we upsetting? And without upsetting anyone, we can't change the status quo. And we can't enact change. So think about that. Sometimes we hear the word upsetting and we think, oh, that's not a polite word. But what we know is in history, when real changes happened, it was because people had an upset. And who are we connecting with? Our brains are always looking to connect. So if we're not connecting, the work really isn't happening. And who are we leading? And we don't have to be an espoused position leader to lead. You can be at any place and point to become a leader. And we want you all to hold those things together in mind. And today I want you to think about what are the potentials that will come out of this time, place, and space together. Because just because these things have happened does not mean we can't pull good and effectiveness from it. So as an early childhood person, this reminded me of World War II and the preschools of Reggio Emilia. These are fancy throughout the globe as the creme de la creme, but what most people don't realize is those schools actually were birthed through World War II. So it was chaos, destruction, and war that really were a large part of how that came to be. So I want us to think about, through all the things that have happened in the last 5 months, I want to say the last century, what can we make come to be as a modern society? And I'm moving fast intentionally, so forgive me. I want to make sure that Tarah Dr. Nunley and Zelica has enough time. So we want you to start off by thinking, what were you taught about others in terms of equity, in terms of modeling, and in terms of, I love this quote, and everybody who knows me know at some point they hear me say this, confronting the discomfort that we experience around issues of equity, liberation, and race. And really considering bias. And I think many people get confused about bias. Bias is a filter, not a lens. I'll say it again. Our bias is a filter, not a lens. Our lens is unfocused, and it's less obvious to us, the person, when we're acting in biased ways. We have to all continuously move ourselves away from leaning on bias as an out. We hear ourselves and others saying things like, that's my bias. I'll always have my bias, or probably my favorite, which I catch myself saying a lot. I recognize and accept my bias. These statements are limiting, and what they do is they box us in to not changing our thoughts, our actions, and our process. So some hard, quick history. It's really important for everybody who's here to understand that the original plan in this country did not include someone who looks like me, who sounds like me, to be sitting here presenting to you. This was never part of the original plan. So the original plan was for me to continue to do what my ancestors were trained or educated to do in school. And those were things like cleaning up, learning how to care for children, learning how to fold clothes, and learning how to sweep. And this is really documented in this awesome book, Preschool Education in America. And these photos actually came from an NAYC article published in the 70s, where it looked at the history of Blacks in early childhood education and how they were educated and what they were educated for. And it wasn't just Blacks, Indigenous people. And if you were not British or German, how you were educated looked different also. So if you were Irish, if you were Polish, if you were Italian/American, your education looked really, really different, even as a white person. So why is this important? Why is this important? Because we can never see this as a one and done. This work is ongoing and continuous. And the takeaway from this slide that I want you all to really get is, so often we have like a monolithic view of Black people. And we think, oh, if it works for this group, then it's going to work for all. We've really got to change that mindset to see that all people, in terms of ethnicities, in terms of tribes, in terms of nations, who they are, you have to have a landscape view, meaning as that landscape shifts and changes, people will shift and change. And that landscape view becomes a strategy and a response to privilege, prejudice, and pride, because they seek to maintain this original plan. This work of anti-oppression, of equity, of liberation, anti-racism is really about planting seeds that some of us will see grow and planting seeds that some of us won't see grow. And it's really important that you hold this mindset of none of this started with George Floyd. It started with colonization in the Middle Passage. Really, really important. So let's jump into some awareness building. So what most anti-bias, anti-racist activists kind of understand that there are levels to this work. And when we step into this work, there are 4 levels that we all need to understand and figure out where we are in terms of doing what we call identity work, and that personal process of figuring out, how do I enter this work and why am I entering this work? And that first level is to recognize that people are newcomers. Newcomers are oftentimes bystanders. They're watching and waiting. They're really never active. They're seeing what happens. Newcomers can sometimes feel under attack because they're still learning, and they find it hard to hear what's being presented. So as I considered the newcomer, I want to share a short story. In August of 2018, I was asked to keynote for Oakland Unified's Early Childhood In-Service. Then afterwards, I was standing outside with a colleague, and we were talking about that year's Build QRS meeting where Dr. Aisha Ray and her colleagues kind of talked about why are all the white people at the policy table. And while I was kind of talking about this great session, my colleague who happens to be white said, Shawn, so where are the white people supposed to work? If we do this, where are we supposed to work? And I thought, well, wait a minute, that's not what I said. That wasn't the question around why aren't a diverse group of people at the policy table. What he heard was not what I said. This is newcomer behavior, that I'm hearing my own response, not even what's being said. So we've got to figure out a way to monitor ourselves around these important issues. Oftentimes we find newcomers reading books, which is a great start, but what we need to know that reading is a passive experience. Writing is an active experience. They actually activate different aspects of the brain. So while reading is an entry point, it can't be your end all be all in terms of your learning. The next level is one that most of you are probably familiar with, and that's this notion of allyship. So what you see here is the picture of parents in Washington, D.C. Most people don't realize that since 2016, they've had about 2,000 Black girls missing from Washington, D.C. every single year, and we don't hear about it in the news. And this was one time where allies showed up. So the allies were actually the white folk in DC. When the parents were in the school, their allies stood outside and they wouldn't let the news outlets in. They wouldn't let other people in to question them. They said, these families are inside trying to figure out for themselves how to keep their families and their children safe. But as an ally, we're standing at the door and we're not letting you in. That's a real great example of allyship. I love this quote from this book, Fierce Conversations. A fierce conversation is one in which we come out from behind ourselves into the conversation and make it real. To me, that's real allyship, when it's doing more than making it convenient for that individual person. This is all identity work. The third level is what we call being accomplice. And I like this word. Accomplices are people who actually take risks. So what you're seeing on the screen now in this former police officer, Carol Horn, who was fired from her job in Buffalo. Some of you may remember this. She resisted. That's her former coworker. He had his knee on the man's neck. She resisted and said, take your knee off of his neck. She lost her job, her benefits, and her pension because she took a risk to become an accomplice. Accomplices actually always don't know the outcome, but they're consistent in and out of the situation. On the right, you see her today in the midst of COVID, still fighting to try to regain her pension and her benefits. So this is the accomplice behavior. They show up and they're prepared to take risk. I have personal experience. So Dr. Nunley, who's going to present, at times has told me, let me take the risk. I need you to do this other thing. She was an accomplice in moving the agenda forward. She showed up for me and for others in the room. So this last level of identity work is this notion of a co-conspirator. So I'm sure you all remember that awful, tragic murder that took place in South Carolina in that church. Some of you may not remember Bree Newsom and James Tyson. This was a perfect example of how to become a co-conspirator. So Bree decided that she was going to remove that flag because of what it stood for, but she didn't do it alone. This was the part that the news completely missed. You see the fence here on the right-hand side that's surrounding the pole. Now, when you look to the left, you see Bree coming down the pole and you see James inside the fence. He has on the yellow vest. Now, before they decided to do this, James was the co-conspirator. They knew, Bree, when you climb the pole, you're going to get arrested. So we need your bail money. We need my bail money. We need a lawyer. It was intentional. It was intentional. The work of removing this symbol of oppression was intentional. While Bree was up at the top of the pole, the police said she won't come down. So what they were planning to do, they were actually going to electrify the pole to electrocute her, to make her fall. And when James heard that, because he was inside the fence, he put his hand on the pole, knowing they're not going to do it now, as a way to prevent her from being electrocuted, a co-conspirator in the movement. It's intentional. It's not erratic. some people don't like the word choice, but it really inspires people around how to be an active and participatory person in real ways that create lasting change. So those are the 4 levels that we want to introduce to you today to kind of bring awareness. So Dr. Bettina Love, who just wrote this book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching in the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. And I like this quote from the book, where she talks about absence versus presence. But I really wanted to share this because what she talks about is what's happening in the country now is what she calls spirit murdering. And she kind of poses the question, how do we return to work, school, our after school programs, our clinics, our doctor's appointments, our community agencies after such spirit murdering events? And it really gives us something to think about as we move forward. I'm coming around to the end. I'm moving fast intentionally because I just want to set a tone. The next thing as individuals you can do is really consider what Dr. Edward Fergus calls bias-based beliefs. Now, his research, and there are lots of research around this, but he synthesized it, really considers that bias-based beliefs happen in 3 ways. They happen around colorblindness, deficit thinking, and poverty beliefs and poverty behaviors. And today, I'm not going to dive deep into this. In the next week, I'm going to unpack this with Dr. Reyes and with Nana Odin on racism. So understanding this new awareness around the 3 low-hanging fruits of bias-based beliefs and how they show up in our lives at home and at work. So in closing, I want to introduce you all to the Equity in the Center, which is in Washington, D.C., created this great kind of approach around moving from being awake to being woke to actually doing the work, creating race equity cultures within our agencies. So this is that structural systemic piece that for those of you who are on the call who are leaders, this is really something for you to consider. And this is, I love this model because when I'm helping agencies and programs who are wanting to do this work, and some are, many aren't, but some are, I actually use this framework. This is a framework and a model to help guide the learning process over long periods of time. So because it's organizational and system-wise, and it looks at these 3, what they call levers, the level of being awake, the lever of being woke, and it's not very linear. They use levers because at one point you may be in the work or the woke stage and get pushed back to being in the awake stage. And there are 4 actually contingencies that they want everybody to consider who take on this equity work as an organization. And the first one is being personal, considering all of our minds are colonized. So how do we begin to decolonize our minds? How do we interrogate what's actually happening as dominant narratives, as accepted by, or supposedly accepted by everybody? And how do we continuously do that internal work? Again, I'm presenting this today. We're going to take some deeper dives next week into all of these. The next piece they want you to consider is the institutional piece. Are we using data? What are our staff saying? How are we responding to our staff's needs around race and equity? Or are we saying everything's fine, no one's complaining? The interpersonal work of being around people who are unlike you, people who are like you, people who are different, people who bring up feelings or thoughts that you've never considered. How do we respect this, acknowledge it, and commit to the ongoing work of having what some people call courageous conversations? I think we've had enough courageous conversations. It's time for us to do courageous work that is past the conversation. Oops, I got excited and knocked it out my ear. The last piece is the structural piece that's really, really big for leaders within agencies and their staff to consider around racial equity work. Like I said, we're going to dive into this next week. In the last slide, I just want to leave you with is a quote that I found on Instagram that I really, really just love. I follow lots of people, but I'm finding that this group, Latinx Parenting, I like a lot of their posts. But the post says, heal yourself, not just so that you can thrive, but to ensure that people who cross your path in the future are safer, from harm. So thank you all for your time and attention. Now I want to introduce to you our first presenter, Tarah Fleming. Tarah's a colleague and a friend of mine, and you'll all find that all presenters today are colleagues and friends of mine who I know in intimate ways. Tarah's presented and created structures within the White Privilege Conference. She was the director of our Families Coalition Education Department. She's done work with iPride around, mixed heritage and multi-ethnic families. And now she's the founding director and lead consultant trainer for Start Dialogue. I'm excited that Tarah is here today, and she's going to present some fantastic information for you in terms of bringing awareness and give you something tangible to walk away with. Tarah and I I'm going to share something personal before I get off the call. For probably the last 2 years, she and I have been talking about, I'm going to share this without your permission, Tarah, really coordinating a social justice and early childhood conference. We've been talking about it for like 2 years, and we were moving to that point where we were going to have it at the Berkeley Adult School. We were starting to look for people, and then COVID hit. We're still talking about it. So we've been in this work a long time together, and Tarah is a committed individual who's committed to bringing like-minded people together to do this work. So let's all give Tarah Fleming a virtual clap and welcome. So Tarah, turn on your mic, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Shawn. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen as soon as you turn yours off.
Oh, I thought I turned it off.
That's right. We will get there when we get there. Thank you for such a lovely introduction too. Yes, it has been years, I have to say. All right, let's get it going. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarah.
All right, so much good information. Shawn, I forgot I was presenting next. I got so into what you were saying. I loved all the definitions of all the ways we talk about allied behavior. That was good to see. I'm glad we're getting more articulation around these ideas. And thank you for your work and for organizing and for having me on with all these distinguished panelists. So my name is Tarah Fleming, and my organization is called Start Dialogue. I'm a white, straight, cisgendered, middle-class woman. I'm able-bodied, I'm degreed, and my family has lived on Miwok and Wintu and Pomo land for about 5 generations. And I don't say that to get, conscious white people cred, but rather to practice saying out loud how some of my identities have impacted my reality. Especially around privilege. And this is an actual skill that I practice regularly, is to start naming some of these realities out loud in practice. So I just want to honor that land. I'm currently in Marin County, which is Miwok land, and I just want to name that. I have 2 mixed heritage sons. One presents white, one presents Black, both proudly identified as Jamaican Americans. And I've committed my life to this work. I began living what I call an anti-racist life when I was 12. I realized my great-grandfather and my grandmother were very outward-facing racists. And I say outward-facing because there was nothing implicit about their bias, extremely explicit. And it ripped my family apart, kind of put us into 3 groups: the racists, the not racist, and the anti-racists, which was pretty much just me for a while, but I'm working on that. But now with the great work of Ibram X. Kendi, he's really challenging us to see that there really are only 2 groups, that there are racists and anti-racists, or living, towards furthering racist ideas and behaviors, and right, or you are furthering anti-racist. And I love this because it really simplifies things. for me, and it really calls us to action, to notice that our behavior is, there's no middle road on this one, right? We are either actively working against it or we are actively benefiting from it, which is in effect perpetuating it. So just a little bit about me and my background and how I came to this work. I have a bunch of slides. I'm going to go through them quickly. My suggestion is to write down some of the reflection questions that I'm going to throw out at you for a later date, for sharing with others. And then I'll take some questions at the end. Yeah, let's just get it going. So my first, let's see. So my first definition I want to share with you is my favorite definition of allied behavior. And I know you talked a lot about the different ways of being ally. Allied behavior is how I refer to this work because it's something that I actually have a choice to turn on or off. It's a behavior. That's part of my privilege as someone with many dominant identities. And so this idea of a behavior is important to me, as I don't get too comfortable in the idea that I am an ally, but more that I'm like in a practice, just like anything, yoga or any spiritual practice or any kind of work practice. It is a consistent and arduous practice. I am unlearning all of the racism that I have been swimming in, so to speak, for my entire life. It is also generationally passed. So I am very aware that I didn't make any of this up, but inherited it from the generation before me and then the generation before them. And so I feel like this idea that being active and consistent is part of the commitment to this work. And so this is kind of the way I like to talk about allied behavior. And I love all the other words: co-conspirator, witness, change agent, agent of change, abolitionist, it's amazing, accomplice, and just really also owning the term anti-racist more, to like really hone in. I am 100% on board with an intersectional reality. Kimberly Crenshaw's work, amazing Black queer woman who coined the term. I want to honor her and her work to bring into light how our identities are intersecting. And I think many of us have been introduced to that. And at the same time, I really want to dismantle white supremacy in myself. And so that helps me, what helps me to do that is to name it specifically and outwardly, saying anti-racist. I'm also bringing into my vocabulary more the term anti-Blackness, to even dive down into being more specific about what is happening right now and what needs to be addressed right now. And as a white, straight, cis woman, being literate and having fluency with these terms, feeling comfortable to use them, to integrate them, is part of the work and the skill base that I feel that practicing regularly helps me to move through this work with a little bit more grace and awareness. So that's allied behavior. You're going to probably get lots of definitions for equity. This is one of the ones I like from National Equity Project, another great organization in Oakland. It's this idea that society will no longer, let's just read it. It is a state that would be achieved if how one fares in society was no longer predictable by race, gender, class, language, or any other social or cultural factor. Okay, so there's never been equity. And so I sit with that. This has never been the case here on this planet, but it is our ultimate goal. And so how can we achieve something that's never been achieved? Well, we just got to keep our eye on the prize, because we keep getting closer with every generation. And it is each generation's, job to try to get us closer to the goal. I love this picture. This is a good one to remind us of there's lots of different pictures. This one I like, just taking an ability framework. This top level this is the equality mindset, right? Everybody gets the same. But clearly, only one person is able to finish the marathon, right? Comfortably or successfully, because the materials were made for their body. And so this is an equality. Everybody gets the same. It's all equal. It's all fair. It's all good. It's part of our national values. And yet, it doesn't work for everybody, clearly. So the bottom is equity. We give everybody what they need. so that they can be successful, so they can finish the marathon comfortably, successfully, and feel as part of the human experience. So one of the skills is to recognize when you are in an equality mindset or an equity mindset. Because I love equality. I want to be paid the same as men, right? But I'm also aware that there are many people who don't have the same advantages of me just by skin color. And so there's an equity issue. So maybe there's going to be a need to have more of for another group. And that doesn't mean less for me. That means everybody gets lifted up. Everybody gets to win the marathon or finish the marathon. So, and then of course, Shawn, I wanted to bring in this visual because I love the name of your workshop. So there's the elephant, and guess what? He's not going to pass the test. This is how things are set up. This is pretty much the equality mindset that we are trying to move away from, and making sure that everybody gets an opportunity to meet the goals in a way that's possible for them, whatever group, whatever identity, whatever past, whatever historical reality that they've experienced. So I had to throw that one in there. All right. So moving along, the next slide, I want to bring in Dr. King here because, well, for obvious reasons, but I want us to notice that for my entire life, I'm going to be 52 in August, for my entire life, we've been told that we need to do this work. Okay, and the fact that he has here that the great stumbling block of the Negro to hit his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, and I'm going to put liberal in there for current purposes, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And I love this piece because I feel that for us, especially white women in decision-making spaces, in leadership roles, in education, which we dominate, that we have a tendency to want to be comfortable, to have less tension, to have less conflict, to have everything nice. We have a very big investment in being liked and having things be conflict-free. And so we are willing to overlook issues, overlook the racism or the sexism or the transphobia or Islamophobia or any of the isms that come into our space because they might bring tension and conflict and upheaval. And so we are being called to move into a place of honoring justice over this nice easiness that we are so committed to. And I love that he explains it this way. And I also just want us to remember that we've been being called to this work for decades and decades and decades, maybe even centuries. And we still aren't rising to the occasion in the way that we could. Thank you, Dr. King, for being here with us always. This next quote that I love, Jeff Hitchcock, he's the author, Lifting the White Veil, a good book. And this is this idea that we have that white supremacy is just the hatred of people of color. And it's not. It also shows up and is expressed in this idea of condescending kindness. And it kind of riffs off the idea that we want things to be nice and easy and non-conflictual. And so we tend to step into this idea of if we're really nice, then everything will go away. Smile and nod, tokenize, do the surface level work. And when we enact that, that is yet another form of supremacy, of white supremacy, and enacting these systems of oppression onto people of color. Because we are not owning our own stuff, which is we want to be liked, we want things to be conflict-free. We want a tensionless environment. So my question, and this is one to write down, is where does condescending kindness show up for you and in your experience? When are we smiling and nodding and saying okay and then not activating? When are we saying this is a great idea but not putting it on the agenda? When are we saying, well, this is super important, I want to center equity, but we're not actually funding it or giving the person who's in charge the opportunity to be a decision maker? There's so many ways that condescending kindness shows up. So I like the word, and I want to honor Jeff for coining it, and also bring it to our attention as an opportunity for us to see when it shows up for us. Paul Gorski, another great thought leader and colleague and friend, highly recommend his work at paulgorski.com. He talks about equity literacy, and this is the term that has recently been coined to call us into the work of being able to see racism in our systems and policies and start to move away from the idea of diversity and inclusion. Super important, but it's not anti-racism work. And so really being able to see injustice happening is actually the skill base. Making sure everybody's included and reflected and honored, super important. We have been doing that for decades. Multiculturalism, inclusion work, diversity work, it's all part of it. But Paul is really asking us to look at this in a framework of where is oppression happening? Where are your policies actually racist or sexist or transphobic, or looking at, not inclusive of all kinds of different families? What's happening there? And can we dismantle that? That is an equity literacy frame. And I highly recommend the article, The Racial Detours to Equity Literacy, which I'll quote, I'll give you the information later, because this is calling us into the current action of this work. It's all important, again, but we need to zero in on how to dismantle these policies, procedures, and behaviors if we're actually going to be successful in reducing the numbers of people of color who are harmed, and trans and queer people who are harmed, and people with disabilities, and so on. We need to do the work a little bit more specifically focused in. Another one by Jeff. This one's good because this kind of calls out our colorblindness that's still alive and well, right? And colorblindness, I love this. It says that rather than packing and getting ready to make the long and arduous journey, road to a multiracial society, a society where no longer structured by race, which is our equity definition, right? Colorblindness sits blindly in the middle of a racially structured society and tells itself it has already arrived. No journey necessary. And so if we are sitting by and saying, I'm already there, I'm already woke, I have lots of friends that look different, I'm doing the anti-bias education work in my classroom, I don't need to take it to the level of really looking at where anti-Blackness lives and anti-racism is not centered. Until we really are able to see that, then we just stay on this hamster wheel where things aren't changing at the rate that we would like to see. So colorblindness is actually, which was brought to my attention, is ableist language, right? And as an able-bodied person, or what I have been reminded, temporarily able-bodied, I thought long and hard about the word colorblind, and thought maybe we could come up with another term. So I did. I came up with, and you'll love this one, you can impress all your friends, is the privilege of oblivion. So we can use that instead of colorblindness because it is exactly what it is. We are staying in our privilege of not seeing or forgetting or not centering or making important. And so one of the questions is, where is your privilege of oblivion showing up? And I can give you an example that, I worked in anti-racism for 30 plus years. And I had a friend one time say to me, Tara, you don't have very good gender analysis. And I was like, what is that? I was like taken aback. And I was challenged. And over time, and working with our Family Coalition, an organization dedicated to LGBTQ people, I really embedded myself in the queer community as an ally and one working on my ally behavior. And I really did learn I had a lot of privilege of oblivion around being heterosexual and cisgender. I didn't even know the word cisgender. And now I feel like I'm way better at supporting and getting behind any kind of movement or change associated with the LGBTQ community, trans people, gender nonconforming people. And I feel like I dug in, I did the work, I was self-reflective of my ignorance and my lack of ability to see the issues. And over time, I have come into much more effective allied behavior and still working on it. Stick my foot in my mouth all the time. All right, privilege of oblivion. That's a good one. So here are some reflection questions. This is the way I do this work, is that I'm constantly thinking about my privileged identities and naming them. And that's why you heard me lead with that. I talk about being white, of European descent, being cisgendered and straight, and I use lots of different words to describe my ethnicity, European and French and English. I'm constantly talking about identity and learning how to language how my privilege shows up. And then I'm also able to see where I'm not privileged, and that's basically with my identity as woman, right? And so it's important to be able to see your privileges as well as some of your target identities, so that you can find out where you need to do your allied work. I'm looking at my privilege of oblivion all the time, where I'm not seeing, what can't I see, being aware of that. And then looking at, what does allied behavior look like for you? What area are you not working right now, right? And that's easy to identify if you can identify your privileged identities. Because who said with great power comes great responsibility? Well, if anybody said Spider-Man, you're correct. Okay, it was actually Uncle Ben for you purists, but I'm sure you know what I'm saying. Okay, so reflection questions, definitely important. And then goal setting. So Paul Gorski has a great way of framing this. And I love this question, and I ask myself this every day, is how can I become a threat to inequity and injustice toward my sphere of influence? So my sphere of influence is just the people that are around me and my work and my family and friends. And this
Tarah,
yes.
There's a question. Do you want to take it now or when you finish?
I'm almost done. So yeah,
Okay.
I'm ready. I'm just about ready to take it. So
Right.
Sure, no problem. So the sphere of influence is just who's around you, right? And so that is where I work. And so sometimes when I get into overwhelm, like I can't fix everything and change everything because, you know, my privilege and identity tells me that I can fix everything and I should know what to do and I have the answers. Instead, I kind of sit back and think about, what is my sphere of influence? And do I have the will to be a threat to the inequity and injustice that shows up? Okay, I'll take a question.
So the question is actually, hi, Kristen. It's from Kristen Spanos, who's the CEO of First Five. So happy to have her here as the leader of First Five Alameda County. So the question is, she's wondering how the privilege of class factors into the analysis.
Absolutely, it's part of it. I mean, it's just on the list, right? Whenever I list them, I always forget one. Absolutely part of this. And class privilege, it allows us to even step further away from our marginalized or from our privileged identities, because it's easy to say, well, you know, I'm a person of color and I have money, so therefore I'm not affected by racism. No, not at all. You still experience racism, right? Even though you have money, right? Or you have access or you have wealth. And I feel like sometimes class is something that is easy to hide behind, so we don't have to do our work around anti-racism. It's an opportunity to like say, oh, well, I was poor, so therefore I can't be racist, which are two different constructs, right? And so that's one of the things about being very clear about all of the different privileged identities you hold and see them very individually, but also see them how they braid together. But be careful of the trap of falling into this places. I had just recently a teenager in one of my trainings stand up and say, I can't be racist, I'm gay. And so we're passing to the next generation this inability to see how privilege works and how marginalization works. And through the work of being able to name and articulate identities, privileged and marginalized, and you are able not only to see where you can be a better ally, but you can see how that plays into your privilege of oblivion. If that's helpful.
Awesome. So I want to add to that, Tarah. I think also because we can't become colorblind and ignore race. When we consider privilege or we consider class, I think it's important to make the distinction that if we're talking about people who identify as white,
yes,
and talking about espoused privilege, and we're talking about class, it becomes really different than if we're talking about two Latinx or two Black people, because then what happens if we're talking about class differences, then what also begins to happen is the duality of the class difference also walks parallel to internalized self-hatred.
Yes.
And that oftentimes isn't the experience for two white people having class differences around having more financial wealth, which is oftentimes what we're talking about, in having less financial, less access and availability to that wealth, which is really attached to power. So the analysis is, it's an important question, but I think when the rubber hits the road, it doesn't actualize the same way because of made up race.
Right.
So it really shows up differently around people who have class differences who are white and people who have class differences who are people of color or indigenous. It doesn't enact the same way because the other thing is running always below the surface. But thanks, Tara, that was excellent. And Kristen, I appreciate the question.
Yeah, I know it's right on. And I always say class, whole other workshop, because it is. It's so ingrained in all of it, right? But I guess the key for me, especially for white people and white women in education and in decision-making places where we can work, is to make sure that we're not using class as a veil to not see and deal with racism, because that happens quite often. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure that we are being able to see all these things individually. It's kind of the skill set. Yeah. Okay, so I think I only have just a couple. I have like 1-2 minutes left.
4 minutes.
I have 4 minutes? I can do so much in 4 minutes. Okay. So this is my to-do list, because I get asked quite a bit, Tara, what do I do? Or I'm sure many of us are being asked by colleagues, like, what do we do? And before I just touch on the to-do list, I love the work of Robin DiAngelo and White Fragility and her book, White Fragility, because she asks the question, which is very profound. Why don't we know what to do? And I feel like this is an amazing question that I've been thinking a lot about, that for decades, centuries, we've been told what's happening by people of color. And we've been given lots of strategies by incredible thought leaders and authors and artists and just people who have been beautifully telling us in so many ways what to do, and we haven't acted. And so now, at a time of action, right now, it's here in our face once again, not new, but here again, we are saying, what do we do? And the question is, why don't we know what to do? Or why aren't we taking all of that we've been told and enacting it? And so I love that. So that's Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, and definitely great book. But this is my to-do list and how I'm working this. I'm practicing an equity mindset, really being able to identify when I'm trying, well, that's not fair, fairness, and like everybody gets the same, and looking more at equity. What do people actually need because of historical trauma or because of the realities of what happened to them?
Tara? Uh-oh. Beth and Leah, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm not really sure what happened here.
Tara froze.
Yeah.
So I will, so Erica had a question that was really about concrete examples for early childhood education and redress inequity models. So Erica, I have a few responses to that. It was a question in the pre-survey that I actually had taken the 2 slides out because I wanted to be mindful of time. But this brand new book, I'm not sure if you can see it, Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Bias Classrooms, is an excellent resource that's specifically brand new for authors who kind of go back to the history of early childhood and look at the foundations, anti-bias, and they give practical strategies. And what I really like about this text is after each chapter, there are reflection questions. So you could use it with staff, your colleagues, to really create a community of learners. I think the other practical things to do when we're thinking of very young children, so one of the questions in the pre-survey was from a teacher who said, I work with toddlers. How is any of this kind of relevant when I'm working with toddlers? And it's relevant because if I work with a 1.5-year-old or a 2-year-old, not only I'm in relationship with them that should be attuned, which is fundamentally different than attachment. We're going to talk about that next month in the session. But my experience is also daily with those adults. So the more that I'm in tune with who this family is, which may be completely different or in addition to what the program is set up to provide or how I was trained, those tasks, those behaviors, that thinking that I have to have as, you know, the teacher really opens up this issue of inequity, so that what practices am I not reflecting on around welcoming families that are actually creating inequities just around how I greet families or how I go over the rules that our program have in place that may be totally contradictory to families. So the one that I think is really prevalent in early childhood is 99% of early childhood programs are independent. We're pushing independence on children because it's a Western value. And what I'm finding is many families are interdependent. So if I'm not fully aware of that dichotomy and all I'm modeling and pushing is independence, I'm setting up an inequity for that family. So it's those unchallenged, unchecked, and unchanged practices that actually create those things. So much of what we do in early childhood really is a great lab for these anti-bias, you know, practices to enact and become real if we go deeper with them. So that's just the beginning, Erica. I have a whole 2 slides that next week that I'm going to dive deeper in, but that text, and I have a bunch of articles that I can add to the handouts link that I'll put there. I'm also going to add, I was looking for it while Tara was speaking because I neglected to put it there, Paul Gorski's article that she was referring to. I'll add that to it also. So for those of you who've already checked it, I highly recommend that you check back tomorrow because we're going to add a lot more items to the handout. All right, so now it is time for us to welcome our next presenter. I'm going to share my screen again. And she is Zelica Rodriguez-Deams, who also is a long-standing colleague and friend of mine, who I've known for years. I like to tell people I knew Zelica before she was married and before she had 2 kids, and I had the honor and the privilege of being in Zelica and Dwayne's beautiful wedding. Zelica is known, you can find her on YouTube, on TV for speaking up around immigrant rights and policies and practices. Zelica created an awesome immigration component to that West Ed trauma training with Julie Nicholson and Julie Kurtz. She's actually one of those people who did that. She's been a program director, really centered around community change and transformation. I'm proud to say that Zelica is one of the people that I am a fan of. So a big thumbs up and welcome to Zelica, who's a new mom. So I need you all to be humble. You may hear the baby, who is she 5 months or 6?
No, she's 7 months, but she figured out how to scream a few days ago.
So you may hear the baby in the background. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So let's all welcome Zelica Rodriguez-Deams to the platform.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shawn, I guess is what your professional name is. I know him as Steve.
So Zelica, I'm telling you about you. So she's known me that long that she called me by my middle name. My godchildren call me by my middle name, and my nephews. So that gives you some context.
Yeah, for sure.
Go ahead, Zelica.
So thanks for having me. I think that this conversation is urgent. It's been a long time. I think, you know, like Tara was saying, it's, again, we're in the situation again where we need to talk about these things. We need to be open. We need to be honest about how we're all feeling and really be aware of what are the actions that we want to take in our personal lives, at work, in our, you know, spheres of influence, just like how are we showing up in these different spaces. So a little bit about me, I am a trans community organizer. So what I'm gonna talk about fundamentally is rooted in that, right? That's really what I strongly believe needs to happen in order for us to dismantle systems of inequity or inequitable systems. I am Latina. I am from El Salvador. My family came to the United States when I was 2 years old. I am raised with 2 Black girls. And so you can imagine I'm having conversations about what it means to be Black women, not as a Black woman. And then also what it means to have kids in cages at the border, right? And so those are 2 very prevalent realities for my girls. I have a 4-year-old who asks a lot of questions, hard questions. And she's been asking a lot of questions about her father and people who look like her father and why are the police good? Are the police bad, right? So I'm having to navigate all these different conversations. Just really quick for our time together, these are the 5 different areas that I want to talk about. But I do want to reiterate the context in which we're having this conversation. COVID-19, it's real, right? We are all sheltering in place, hopefully. You know, we know that in the past, pandemics have reshaped societies in profound ways. Empires have fallen, governments have cracked, and so on and so forth. We have climate change crisis, so fires, sea levels are rising, warmer summers, you know, the ice is melting, like all these different things are the reality. We have mounting racial tensions. You know, police violence is amongst the leading cause of death for Black men. And then we have November 2020 and this madness that we're calling our current administration in the White House and everything that's coming out of the Supreme Court, right? So these are all the things that we're having to think about when we think about what is our action plan? How are we showing up at work, at home, and all these different places? So we are going to get into a little bit about what is the difference between equality, equity, justice, and liberation, and really how do we set our intention around what our end goal is, like what our end game is. The difference between the equity lens and equity mirror. I was actually at a conference a few years ago on the collective impact modeling, and it was mind-blowing to hear, you know, that a lot of us, you know, the new sexy term is talking about equity, the equity lens, but not a lot about the equity mirror and how internally as organizations, nonprofits, institutions, how we are looking at our everyday operating practices and how are they mirroring those equity conversations that we're having externally. Like I said, I am a community organizer at heart and a trained one. And so really looking at how we're not just addressing the systems of root causes, but how do we start to talk about root causes in our everyday planning conversations and every day with our, you know, the folks that we're serving. And then the importance of authentic community engagement. What is the difference between input, feedback, decision-making, and then, you know, community, the people that we directly serve, how are we taking their lead in what they define as change? And then how does all this, like, what does this all mean for you individually, right, specifically? So I'm sure you guys have all seen this. I copied this from the Story-Based Strategy website. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but because I know that it's been a graphic that a lot of folks have seen, but I did want to highlight the differences in equality, equity, reality, and liberation. At Somos Mayfair, which is the organization that I currently work for, we have these conversations often and how problematic equality and equity can sometimes be, right? For us, and in thinking about how we push on other institutions or how we push on other systems to really think about equitable distribution of resources or how they are bringing community to the table to create changes together, we still think that equality and equity is in relationship to a system. It's still within the boundaries of a system, right? for us, liberation is in relationship to each other, right? So how the community together comes together and really thinks about the kind of future, the way that they want to pave the way forward. How are they working together to really create a different vision, a different world for their future? Looking at, again, looking at this reality and having conversations about how do you name the injustice and inequities that our communities are facing. So I just wanted to share that for you. And I think for me, just wanting to share a concept of that equality and equity still seem to be on the onus of institutions and not necessarily bringing in community leaders, consumers, clients to the table to kind of figure out and define that together.
Zelica,
Sure.
people are asking, where can they get that photo that you have up with the liberation one? They're asking, did you name a place?
Yes, it's the story-based strategy.
Story-based strategy.
Yeah, it's their website. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can share. There's like a whole article on it and what it means and.
Okay, we'll put it in the handout.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in the liberation, like right here on my right, I think one of the things that is often not talked about is the fence, right? And that the fence is very much a part of our context, right? Because if you look at equality, equity, and reality, we're talking about the resources that are necessary for people to have the same level of access. Absolutely, that's incredibly important, and we need to talk about those things. And then can we also have a conversation about the fence and who built that fence and who decides who can stay on this side of the fence versus playing the game, right? And so for me, that's a conversation that I think is necessary now. Yes, there is still a lot that we have to do around equity. There is still a lot that we have to talk about equality. I think like Tarah said, I would also like to get paid as much as a man, right? And I also strongly believe that a lot of the folks on the ground, a lot of the people that we serve are beyond that. And they're saying, we're tired of talking. We need to see action. And action for a lot of folks is really rebuilding that fence, tearing down that fence, reclaiming that fence, right? And so those are the conversations that I think a lot of us are ready to have.
Thank you. And I just want to add, Zelica, that Dr. Reyes next week, for those who are going to register and attend next week, his presentation is really about liberation. So for those who aren't familiar with the liberation ideology, he's really going to introduce that and introduce an approach to racism using liberation as a strategy. So thank you, Zelica.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, and I will say this is coming to more of a head for us because we are seeing all the emergency response work that we're having to do during COVID, right? We're doing diaper distribution, we're doing formula distribution, we're distributing funding, right? There's like all these different things that we're distributing. And something that keeps coming back is how in all of the work that we've done, right? 23 years of existence for our organization, how in all of the work that we have done, how have we prepared our families to be in a better situation now, given this crisis? And then what we're doing now is improving the situation for folks moving forward, right? So if there is a second wave, if there's, people being displaced and evicted. So how are we thinking about our work and how are we thinking about beyond the organization? What are some of the systems and kind of community ownership that we need to really start working through so that our communities are just in a much better place next time around?
So someone asked, I think you covered this, but maybe you can just repeat it quickly, what the premise of the fence is in the photo.
That's interesting. So it's just a way of showing very literally, right? If everybody's gonna be invited to watch a game, how does everybody kind of see the game from, kind of have the same perspective, right? And how are they seeing that? More recently though, people are talking about, well, can we actually break down what the fence means? Traditionally, or when this graphic was initially shared, the fence really didn't have that much meaning other than how do we support people in seeing over the fence in the same way? Now we're saying, hold up, why is there a fence there in the first place? What does that mean around, again, who built the fence, who owns the fence, who has the right to cut that fence down or remove the fence? And I think for us, we're saying the fence shouldn't exist. Does that help?
I agree. No,
Okay. Okay.
I believe in naming entertainment. I'm a Dan Siegel fan. I just need to call a thing. And I
Yeah.
think it's important for people to hear that the fence is a representation of racism.
Yeah.
The fence is a representation of different and othering of people. The
Yeah.
fence says the rest of us are in seats.
Right.
We're watching the game from a different vantage point. It's intentional that these people who are behind the fence are all black and brown. That's not by accident. So we've got to call it out if we want to address it. If we don't really name it, then we're murking around and we can't really deal with it. So the fences are visual representation of the structures that have existed pre-colonization.
That's right.
Really, that still exists, and that we've attempted to normalize something that isn't normal around how humans dehumanize others. Very, very important for us to get that this is a literal visual representation of what's enacted each and every day, and it remains unchallenged, unchecked, and unchanged. So the liberation ideology is really the direction that says, we must change these things. We're not having just conversations. We're going to change these things in positive, productive ways. And one of the ways is by naming it, saying, here's why this is incorrect. Here's why this is still limiting. Here's why this, even if we start on the equality side, why it's necessary to, interrogate one's self-thinking and practices to move towards liberation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know any other way to state it.
Yep, perfect. And I will say that I also think it breaks down that boundary or that barrier between how we operate and the people that we serve, right? And so I'll get into that when I talk about the equity mirror. But again, I think for a lot of organizations, I think like you mentioned, right, Maurice, that a lot of organizations are just starting to have these conversations, and there's organizations who are already doing concrete things about it, right? Like there's action that is being taken. And so I also think, like, how are we setting up our internal structures, our operating agreements, whatever that looks like? How are we using the same criteria that we use to think about kind of like our external presence, and like, how do we think about equity externally? Like, how are we practicing that in our everyday work life too? To your point, right, around what you shared earlier. So what does liberation mean to me? It's the act of struggling against systems of oppression with the ultimate goal of self-determination, the right to opportunity for freedom of thought, expression, and action. And so for me, this is not about working within a system. It is about, or in relationship with the system, right? This is paving a new way forward. This is community members in relationship to each other. This is about institutions and systems actually creating a space for these conversations to happen, not dictating how these conversations should happen, right? I also think to the context setting that I did a few minutes ago.
Can you talk about that some more, Zelica? I think you just said something that was quite powerful, and it was simple but powerful. That whole around what you just said before I interrupted.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think in the context setting, we are at a place where we have to reimagine a new way forward, right? We have to think very differently about how our structures are set up, how we actually interact with the people that we serve, right? This is about beyond any organization, beyond any institutions, how we set up our communities to be successful. And it doesn't depend on funding, right? It doesn't depend on what our strategic plan is, right? Like, I think all of those things, they play a role, but the end goal, right? The end game is really to support our community and paving a new way forward. And that it is the role of organizations, institutions, governmental institutions to hold space for community to have that conversation for themselves, not to dictate how that conversation should be had, right? So me, for example, I am raising 2 Black girls. I can't come in and say, well, Black people should do this. No, I don't know. I feel that I am in solidarity with a lot of the folks, friends, family, but that's not enough, right? It's not enough for me to think. I think, like Tarah said, it's no longer enough for me to read about it, but my contribution can be, how do I hold space for people to talk about how this is impacting them? What are the things that they want to see different? How do we reimagine a new future? Because the time is now. We are in a place of pandemic. We know that a lot of our kids are going to come out of shelter in place, needing a lot more support than before the shelter in place. Kids are not regulating the way that they used to, right? Like there's a lot of different things that we need to take into account. And I think that how do we do that with also looking at, if we have to scrap the system that we were supporting or that we were living within, like what does that look like now? And it's been really hard to get to this point. It's been really hard for people to say, what does a new future look like?
And I think that to add to that, Zelica, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, we have about 10 minutes. I think what we have to name is that I think all people are experiencing unnamed loss or unnamed potential loss, and there's fear attached to that. And there's even sometimes shame attached to it, or guilt or anxiety, in that it's really important to name that. And I think for me, the context of this broad conversation is the unnamed loss that people believe they might experience. So they're resisting the change because of this belief in loss that, you know, and we know that real or perceived is real to them, but it's actually a game, because there's a plethora of research that basically says, specifically in this country, when things happen for Black people in this country, everyone benefits. Everyone. When we enact change that Black people are supposed to benefit from, everybody benefits from it. So part of the change for me is for people to really get, oh, what am I fearing? What is the fear? What do I believe I'm going to lose if we bring another chair to the table and add key people who we're talking about? What is the fear? And that's that internal work that I think is the beginning of the process. And I think agencies have a responsibility to, when people are doing the individual work at the systemic level, having this ongoing and continuous, not just conversation, but policy and practice change that resembles that inside and outside of our agencies. You know, because I think that is the change effect we're talking about. That it creates change for everybody. It creates change for children, teens, elders, citizens, no matter who you are, no matter where you are. And it seems idealistic to people, but it's not. It's actually very human-centered.
Yeah.
All right, get back to your presentation.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I do want to talk a little bit about the equity mirror. I feel like I'm doing a lot of jargony talk, and I do want to talk about this in a way that is more specific to what organizations can do today, right? Like, how do they start asking themselves some of these questions? And so I think oftentimes we do talk about the equity lens as something that's outwardly focused, like it's an outwardly focused tool. It's what we use to plan and reflect on our different processes. We think about that as part of our strategic plan, but often not in like our daily operational systems, right? It's not something that's often institutionalized, right? So for me, it comes up a lot in our staff, and we like, oh, let's use the equity lens. And people actually don't know what that means in practice, right? Theoretically, yes, it makes sense. Like, that's right. We are at a time, we have to figure this out. But I think in practice, what does that look like? What are the benchmarks? What are the checks and balances to whatever we're producing, that it does have that lens, and that we are naming and holding ourselves accountable first as an organization before putting something out, right? And so this is where the equity mirror comes in, right? I learned about it in a collective impact forum space a few years ago, and it was mind-blowing. I think a lot of organizations were like, oh, if we look internally, no, our systems and our processes are not aligned with that criteria. They are not aligned with that lens, right? And I think it speaks to the institutional level of racism, right? Where we think racism happens amongst people, amongst groups of people, right? But not necessarily how much it's part of our organizations and how intentional it's been for centuries, right? I think to your point earlier.
Or not just centuries. For me, I was having this conversation with some family members, that there are people who are still alive and who still vote, who are still alive and who still vote, who in the 40s and 50s really had a hard stance against people who look like you and I.
Right.
And some of those people's mindsets have not changed at all. And they're still alive, and many of them are in positions of power. So for people who think this isn't real, it's very, very real. And I think it's shifted in some ways, but in other ways, it stayed exactly the same.
I mean, what's happening now is a really good example, right? Around the police brutality, police use of force, and that, you know, I have family who are law enforcement and they're amazing people, but we're not talking about people, I mean, sometimes we're talking about people specifically. But if you look at the organization and why the organization was created, until they have a conversation about anti-Blackness and what does it mean to, you know, serve in that way, like until we have a real conversation about why that organization started, we're never going to get to, you know, what needs to be reformed today, or what needs to change, or what needs to be abolished today, because really, like, is it necessary? And that's a whole other webinar, a whole other conversation. But I think I hear that a lot about in immigration too, and ICE, and, you know, ICE is meant to keep terrorists outside of the country. Okay, that's one perspective. And the reality is that ICE is also keeping kids in cages. So where are you landing on that, in that argument? And if you look at why ICE was created, also it's fundamentally, it was created on a fundamentally racist premise, right? And so I think that if we don't have an equity mirror, and if we don't have benchmarks, and if we don't really look closely at how we're set up as serving organizations, serving delivery organizations, then we can actually reinforce some racial inequities, right? And so I want to offer some questions. I think I took Tarah's cue. So what are some checks and balances in the way that you operate in your own organization around equity? How do the equity conversations show up in your operating agreements, or in your own development? And I guess I was trying to say here, like, professional development, right? Because oftentimes we say, oh, you need to, I don't know, improve your time management, or, oh, I need you to, you know, work on your ability to turn things, I don't know, be more strategic in this thing that you're developing, but not necessarily around how we show up at work and the kind of messages that we deliver. What does accountability look like when you think about your own standards of equity? And so both internally and externally, right? So again, this idea that equity is sometimes an externally focused conversation, and not necessarily so much internally. And not just the conversation, but how is it showing up in our written materials, when people step through our doors, and how we support or not support our staff. And then I also think most important to me, equally as important as our organization shifting culture, is how are we also including community voice in shaping that. So I wanted to include this because I do think it's also important to recognize that for a very long time, and up until very recently, a lot of organizations have focused on service delivery through a charity approach. And I think it's incredibly important and helpful because we are seeing that people still need basic needs, right? We're still seeing that people need food, shelter, medical help, right? Medical services, like these are all things that people need to survive. And I also think more recently, organizations are starting to think about the root causes. Mm-hmm. Like, why are people poor? Why is there violence in our communities? Why do we have disparate, health patterns? Like, what does that all mean? And how do we actually also start having those conversations? I'll give you a really good example. So in San Jose, which is where I've been for the last 10 years of my life, we have been talking about, our immigrant families and the fact that they need a place to live. They need, food, they need education, they need all of these things. And so we're like, okay, let's put Band-Aids. Let's kind of figure out these short-term fixes. And we're coming to a place where we're like, no, it's impossible. We need to start talking about quality education, an equitable distribution of funding, Prop 13, what schools get what resources, what does it mean for foster care, foster youth, ELL students, low-income students, right? Like, how do we get into these deeper conversations that allow us to actually serve our communities a lot better and in different ways, right? Maybe more robustly, maybe a bit more comprehensively and more holistically. And I think, we're also not at a place that, we've also talked a lot about the Maslow's hierarchy of need, right? So it's like, you address the basic needs, and then the physiological needs, and then the social emotional, right? It's like all these things, and then you get into like agency and empowerment. And we're like, yes, but if that actually gets flipped on its side, you have to address the physiological, right? So that basic need, but also make sure that people feel empowered, feel like they have decision-making power over the way that they want to liberate themselves. Like, we are there. We can't say this is a linear process. We are there. We need to figure out how we carry both of these realities in a place to actually get to some real solutions. I did want to share, and I think you probably going to put this on the Dropbox, Maurice, but it's the our community engagement philosophy that we've written over years of work.
It's up there. What you emailed me?
I just wanted to offer
it's up
it
there.
as
It's
a
in the
reference.
handout box.
But I did want to share the difference between all of these different things, right? And the fact that at different points in time in our work, we may utilize these different approaches, but at the end of the day, what is going to move the needle on the work that we're all doing, right? And so recently we did I led a process of community forums for the city of San Jose, because they wanted to look at what are some of the anti-displacement policies that they wanted to take on. Really interesting, because they lived in the first two buckets. They wanted outreach and they wanted input. And a lot of the perspective that came back from community members were like, no, we're tired. We already told you what's needed. We've already talked about this. It's been clear, like, we're being displaced, we're being kicked out, the housing crisis sucks, like all these different things. We've already talked about them. What's different now in our processes? How are we showing up differently for our community members and for our staff? And so we talked a lot to the city of San Jose, which traditionally has not been open to really talking about community decision-making. Mm-hmm. What does it look like to have advisory boards? What does it look like for them to do participatory budgeting and actually fund the things that they want to fund? Right? Like, how do you start to move in a direction where maybe we're following the lead of community members who actually know how to address these like multi-generational problems that we still are struggling to address, because we're not having these other conversations that, we've just had, right?
I think that's a great place to stop. Okay. Around people know what they need. So it reminds me of, how do we begin to ask better questions, in questions that we don't believe we already have the answer to? Again, letting go of our power and our position, because people know what they need. People know what they need. And if they know what they need and we believe that, the shift isn't for them to shift, but for us to shift. So thank you, Zelica. So happy you in your busy life, your productive life, you were able to come and share the community perspective with us. So thank you so much. We appreciate you. And the handouts in her slide deck are already in the handout folder. Thank you so much. All right, so we're moving right along to our final presenter today is Dr. Patricia Nunley, who is a tenure-track professor at City College San Francisco. She's taught at Mills, San Francisco State, and Berkeley City College. She's on the newly formed anti-racist ECE committee at City College San Francisco. And Dr. Nunley is actually the regional Western representative for the Association of Black Psychologists. And about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, she hosted 2 separate Facebook African and USA kind of Facebook sessions that were awesome, where people across the globe kind of talked about healing in Blackness in the world. Today, she's going to talk about the African Ubuntu pedagogy and how enabling students to experience this notion of mattering in settings with all of us. So I introduce to some and present to others, Dr. Patricia Nunley. So your mic needs to come on, Dr. Nunley, because it doesn't look like it's on.
Okay, it's on
awesome.
now.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and it's all yours.
So good afternoon, or excuse me, good morning, but it's almost afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to get started, and I am truly an early childhood educator, so you're going to see what I mean in just a minute. So let me share my screen here. All right. So thank you to my fellow presenters. I really appreciate the fact that the first presenter talked about, it's about anti-Blackness. So thank you, I appreciate that. And second presenter saying that it's time for something different. So first of all, my presentation is about why equity won't get us there. This is the case for AUP, an African Ubuntu pedagogy. Again, my name is Dr. Patricia Nunley. My African name is Karabo, and that was given to me when I was in South Africa. And Karabo means answers. Okay, so welcome again to Addressing the Elephants in the Room series. I always teach with elephants, so hey, thank you, Shawn. Shawn's like my godson, so here's my elephant. Thank you so much.
Because at the time, I didn't tell everybody that the elephants in the room actually came from Dr. Nunley. When she teaches every class, she comes to class and she puts the elephants on the desk. It was the first time I ever saw that. And she's made students sit in circles to address elephants in the early childhood context. So I pulled that kind of cliche from her in practice. So thank you, Dr. Nunley.
Thank you. Okay, so now I have it in the right format. So first, before I start, I need to give honor to my special ancestors, Baba Kambon, Baba Asa, and Nsamiyan. And also I want to give thanks to the ancestors of my discipline, which is Janice Benson Hale and Amos Wilson. So first of all, this is a virtual interactive webinar for me. So that means it translates to moving and learning. So I'm going to need you to get ready to actively move. I need you to be comfortable with silence because you're going to pretend that you're talking, thinking, and talking back to the screen. So warning, okay? So get ready for that. Be ready to move around. Okay, I'm going to start with Sanibona, which is hello to the group. Now I'm speaking in isiZulu, which is a South African language. And so Sanibona to the whole group, Sa'ubona to you individually. And when someone says Sa'ubona to you, you say, yeah, bona, yeah, Sa'ubona, which is yes, hello. So Unjani is how are you? And Giapila is I am fine. So if the child is not white, Giapila, I am fine, is actually a lie. I don't know if you know these folks here, these children. At the top, that is Trayvon Martin when he was in preschool. And then we have Ariana Jones. Okay, so then Trayvon gets older, then we have Tamir Rice. Now, Tamir was 12 years old. Okay, then the latest person who was a victim to the racism was Breonna Taylor. And then on the other side of her is Sandra Jones. I put Ariana under, I put them under her because she was in her grandmother's arms sleeping when she got shot and killed when the police came in the house. So then Breonna Jones, we know that just happened to her. So I don't know if you know this young man. So it really doesn't matter, even if, now this young man is atypically developed, but it didn't matter what happened to him. And this was so sad. If you look at the center picture, those are police officers that are actually mocking and making a joke of it. So the top, in the middle, the top and the bottom are the actual officers that was responsible for his death. In the middle, these are current officers. I think this happened 5 days ago. They're making a joke about it. It's funny to them. So now people say that some things are for Black people and some things are for white people. Here's an example of Black people doing, quote, white stuff. One was a cosplayer. I don't know if you guys know what cosplay is. My child is atypically developed and she loves this. It's like her whole world. They take on all these other characters and do all, you know, they live in a virtual world. So cosplaying is not something typically we think Black people do. And then of course we know about jogging, our latest jogger, and we know what happened to him. Now notice one's biracial and the other's African-American dark skin. So doesn't even matter if you light skin Black or dark skin Black, you're still Black, and yeah, still an issue. So right now for African-American people and even brown people, we're experiencing what should be called a twin pandemic. Now, COVID-19, that's a global pandemic, and they're calling it novel because they're saying this is new, right? The other pandemic for Black people and brown people is racism, being racist. Now that's classic, that is not new. So for Black people in the USA, we are experiencing twin pandemics. So COVID-19 is causing us to have to bury folks disproportionately. Notice the children are involved in this too. This is a funeral in New Orleans where the casket is carried horse-drawn, which is typical in the culture. And then of course we see all the protests saying, can we just stop killing Black people, right? So I say to you, Caesarian in guerra. Caesarian in guerra. So I started out with isiZulu. isiZulu is from the Zulu people it's their language, the Zulu people in South Africa. Look at this map at the very bottom in the blue, you see there's South Africa. Now, what's interesting about South Africa, it has the most white people on the whole continent of Africa. So much so that when you go to South Africa, the people are called the Afrikaans. They actually say that they're not a part of Africa. They're a part of something else. But so we were in the blue area in South Africa. Now I want you to find the pink. Look at the pink, Kenya. So now I was speaking in Kiswahili. So because I'm talking about the world and Africa, I want you to look at this map. Can you find the United States of America? It's purple. And then you see the continent of Africa. We want to believe that the United States is larger than life and bigger than so many things, but it's not. The United States is a country within a continent. Africa is a continent, but people sometimes act as if it's a country. It has 52 countries in it. So I just want you to actually look and see a real visual. This is called a Peters projection map, which shows you the correct layout of continents. Okay, so I'll go back to Caesarian Ngera. What the heck is that? Now she's speaking Swahili. Well, it means, and how are the children? So this is how our children are right now. So, and guess what? It's evidence-based that for Black children, it's a mess. Because we like to think of evidence-based. There's research and statistics, the news media, social media, housing, homelessness, unemployment, and whoa, that's right, we're the essential workers too. There's the jails and the prisons, but now thanks to COVID, as well as the heightened racism, the hospitals and the morgues. That's all evidence-based, but guess what? You in your classroom, you also are evidence-based because we don't do well in your classrooms. So now when I worked on my dissertation, I did something around student-teacher relationships with Pianti. He created this particular scale. So now this is the interactive part, one of them. So I want you to imagine a child. And I need you to pick the child that's really, really challenging. That's like, oh my goodness. Just imagine, pick that child. Okay, so then you got the child's name. Then, okay, what is the child's gender? And then what's the ethnicity and the age of the child? So now you're gonna answer some questions about that child. Hold that child in your mind. This is what, and this is a child that gets on your nerves. So I want you to answer this. On a degree from 1 to 5, I share an affectionate, warm relationship with this child. So 1 means you do not, 5 means that you definitely do. Again, this is that child that you have difficulty with. The child and I are always struggling with always seem to be struggling with each other. Answer it again. If upset, this child will seek comfort from me. Answer that question. The child is uncomfortable with physical affection to touch from me. Answer that one. The child values his or her relationship with me. When I praise this child, he or she beams with pride. This child spontaneously shares information about himself or herself. The child easily becomes angry with me. It is easy to be in tune with what this child is feeling. The child remains angry or is resistant after being disciplined. Dealing with this child drains my energy. When this child is in a bad mood, I know we're going to be in for a long and difficult day. This child's feelings toward me can be unpredictable or can change suddenly. This child is sneaky or manipulative with me. This child openly shares his or her feelings and experiences with me. So this is a short version of a questionnaire, a survey questionnaire that Piante created in 1992. And the point is for you to see what type of the quality of relationship you have with the child.
Dr. Nunley, can I just interject? As you were listing those, I want to encourage everybody to go back if you remember, or when you get the handout, a copy of the slide deck, to replace the word child with the word adult. Because as you were listing them, in my head, I kept thinking about adults who may push me towards those reactions or responses. So when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about race and racism, I think these questions can help us to do some self-check and some reflection around our internalized, unchallenged, unchecked, and unchanged reactions towards others.
I love that. Thank you, Shawn. And I will make sure that I send the question, put it so that you can get it to everybody. So that I really love that. Yeah, thank you, my brilliant baby. Okay, so now let's go back to this Black child. Okay, I also have this this picture, right, of the equality, equity, and liberation, but I have issues with the picture, so I'll keep going. So I have why I have issues with, because I have issues with the concept of equity. So instead, I'm saying equity is not going to get us there. I'm just totally convinced of that. So what we need is something called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is the belief that you are defined by your compassion and kindness toward others. I don't think we have humanity. And if you don't think everyone's a human being, guess what? I can't give you equality, equity. I can't give you anything because I don't even see you as human. So that's why I'm saying we need to first get that. We need to get Ubuntu toward each other. So now, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he says Ubuntu is the essence of being human. And I won't for sake of time. So he talks about not, I highlighted the words, not being in isolation, interconnectivity, and caring about, and when you act like in a certain way, it spreads to the whole of humanity. Now imagine with COVID-19, we were supposed to physically quarantine, to isolate ourselves. That doesn't work for Black people and people of color. We can't, we're in community, we're connected. So that's very, very hard for us to physically isolate because we're a social people. And if we're going to talk about disparities, disproportionately, Black and brown people, we are the ones we're going to be living in crowded conditions. We're going to be the essential workers, all those things that it's like for us to isolate, there's only one bathroom and 7 people in the house. So it doesn't really work. No one has their own bedroom, et cetera. So Ubuntu, according to Bishop Desmond Tutu, this is what he says about it. Okay, so now, but guess what? I go to South Africa all the time. And my Black South African colleagues was like, you know what, Patricia? You African Americans got this stuff all wrong. Ubuntu is not for white people. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? And they're like, it is not for white people. I'm like, but I teach all color students, and I got this whole crew, the Rainbow Coalition, and we all do Ubuntu. They're like, no, y'all got it wrong. It is not for white people. So I had to find out why, because they meant what they said and they said what they meant. And so I had to really dig deep and understand that. It is based on the history that in South Africa, they had something called apartheid. And that is when Afrikaans, when white people are similar to when we had segregation in the USA. So Jim Crow, not Jim Crow, the slavery. And then as a result of that, yes, I did mean Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws that separated Black.
It was American apartheid. It's the same thing. American apartheid.
Thank you. So they experienced that. So, and then guess what? Then they had something called, so they found out how inhumane white people could be, right? And then they had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Council. The whole world looked to South Africa to see if like, wow, because with this, it's like, okay, now Mandela's out and now apartheid's over. So we're gonna all come together and kumbaya, we're gonna love each other. This is just gonna be great, right? And so when they had this council, what actually happened? White people came, they confessed their sins. Black people came, they confessed the things that they did. But guess what happened? Nothing to the white people. Some of the Black people actually end up going to jail.
So we have about 7 minutes left, Dr. Nunley.
Okay. So they say that Ubuntu is not for white people because white people never asked to, they didn't know, they never asked us to forgive them. And so why are you running around trying to make them do something that they don't want? But I don't agree with that. I agree with my ancestor in Samanang that we have to be inclusive and that there's 7 billion people. Some are individualists and some are collectivists, and we're on a common planet. And I live in the United States of America and I teach a diverse group of people. So I cannot say that I believe Ubuntu can be for everybody. Okay, so Ubuntu is an approach, not a curriculum. It's grounded in an African worldview. It uses traditional African-centered practice. So now I'm probably not gonna be able to do all the interactive stuff now. So let me skip really fast. So when I was coming up with African Ubuntu or AUP, I had to do something called Sankofa. So that was go back and fetch what was valuable from the past. So all people possess a worldview, and your worldview is just basically how you function in the world. Okay, so for Black people, African Americans, they're into groupness, sameness, commonality, humanism, and religion. For European American, individualism, uniqueness, difference, and they also have white supremacy. The word is, when we use the word white supremacy, we're already setting ourselves up for a deficit. We should be using this new word called white misanthropy, which is totally different, because if you already say the person's supreme, it starts a bunch of other conversations. Okay, so when these are a comparison of the two, your worldview is an epistemology, ontology, cosmology, axiology. So if we could just do that real fast. So if you just touch your brain right here and you go like this, that's epistemology, right? It's your thinking, epistemology. And then if you jump oncology, the oncology, you have to remember that one, and cosmology, and then axiology. So these are the components of a worldview. We would have did that standing up, but I'm gonna go fast. Okay, then there's this little memory song, this movement that I've taught my students. It's not one, but two worlds, the visible and the invisible. Each person is connected to a single energy source that allows us to be in the past, the present, the future, all at the same time. Again, we would have stood up and done that, so I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so now, I just told you there's a big difference between European and African worldview. In addition, African human development says that we are spirit beings. So as an African people group, we are spirit beings. What the heck does that mean, Dr. Nunley? Okay, so this is the difference between a spirit being and a human being. So so basically, when you look at the different worldviews on human development, European says we are biosocial, psychosocial, and cognitive. African says the same thing, but there's a spiritual base. So the spirit is everything. That's what, and everything else builds on top of that. European worldview, there's no spirit. Okay, so again, the foundations are different. There's a spirit foundation, African, no spirit foundation, European. Okay, so in our discipline, old dead white men who studied their own children, right? These are our Western fathers of human development.
So Dr. Nunley, I think I just want to stop, and I'm going to clarify this because someone's saying we're all spirit beings. And I think it's important to talk about that. You're talking about theories. These are people who created theories for human development, yes, theories for education that we follow. So in the theories, when people are learning these in college, you don't talk about the spirit domain in any education classroom. So African-centered education in psychology introduces the spirit component as another way to see. It's a lens view of seeing people, all people. So
thank you.
I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am talking theoretical framework.
We got 3 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, let me keep going. So then basically in the fathers of early childhood education.
I just talked about this. You can skip this. We just did this.
Okay, all right. And so these are the mothers. These are some of our theories. Okay, so African Ubuntu recognizes that the original child was African, because what happens is we took 5% of the children and do it to the whole 95%. And we say everybody's like that. But Dr. Alan Pence in Canada, he says, no, that's not true. He understands that the Eurocentrism takes away from who other people are. So Ubuntu, Ungubantu means I am because you are. Okay, so different worldviews. African worldview, we believe in we are people together. The European is like I'm somebody because I know how to think. Okay, so I'm gonna skip that. I'm gonna skip
which
this.
is very similar to what I said earlier around independence, which is what we push in the Western world, opposed to interdependence. Interdependence is we are. Independence is, I think as an individual.
And so this, again, in Samanon, he recognized that there's multiple pathways to child development, right? So like, do you even know these Black mothers of education? These are Black women that tell you about Black children. So when we want to know about a Black child, do we ask Black people or do we go and ask the white theorists, okay? Do you know these fathers of Black education? Do you know these contemporary ones? We already talked about Bettina. Yeah, do you know these people? So if you want to know about Black children and you want to know about the theories, talk to these people. I identify as an African teacher. I consider myself a Zinganga. So as a healer, my medicine is education. I use it to fight the disease of ignorance, right? And so African teachers, I'm going to go really fast. African teachers believe that we can teach everyone. We can teach everyone because we see everyone as human. And because right now the COVID-19, the effect on Black and brown children disproportionately, because of all the Black Lives Matters, the racism, the police, state-sanctioned violence, et cetera, if you're gonna work with children, you need to do something different, and equity is not gonna get you there. Okay, so these are, let's see, I'm just gonna So the AUP principles is about identity development. Everybody's identity is fine. Everyone's identity, Black, white, brown, green, everybody's, right? There's you are who you were made to be, and it's fine. It focuses on racism first and foremost, because racism causes the anti-Blackness and all the other stuff, and it thinks about the other isms. It's a communal relationship, and it focuses on healing from racial trauma. It's not simply like the ACE that never talks about racial trauma, which is highly problematic. And it talks about transformation, not, remember the picture with the fence? Well, guess what? I'm still not in the game. That's a problem. That's why I don't like that particular thing. So liberty, I
want us to do me a favor. We're going to stop at the principles.
Okay.
Because we're running out of time.
Okay.
And people are asking questions. They want your slides. They want the name of the people.
Okay.
So,
wait, let me say bye then. Okay, let me just go here. wait, I do want to say this. You got to know there's some non-European cultures that respect other cultures. Barbara Rogoff, right? Howard Gardner, okay? Louise Dormer Sparks. You see, so but guess what? Louise, once they have a Black child, that's when they really start caring. And this is the picture, the one you were talking about, the latest thing. Okay, so I just want to say, now I'm going to say Giyabonga, which is thank you, and Salagasha, go well. That's isiZulu, now I'm done. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Nunley, for that deep space into African-centered psychology and education and how to support all children from an African-centered perspective. So we thank you for that. We've now are at the end of today's, what I think was awesome introduction panel presentation from Tarah, from Zelica, and from Dr. Nunley. A lot of people were, just as a closing, a lot of folk were saying, how do you register for next week? Leah posted in the chat box the link for registration. So if you register for today, you're not automatically registered for next week. You're going to get a link to evaluate today's session. Please do that. Next week, like we said, we're going to have Nina and Dr. Reyes. He's going to present liberatory critical race pedagogy. Nina's going to present anti-racist spaces for Black children. I'm going to come and do some stuff about calling in, calling out, and then calling back in. We're going to talk about communication structures. I'm going to go deeper with bias-based beliefs. We're going to spotlight colorism and duality. And of course, for those who ask, this session was recorded and it'll be posted probably in 24 hours on First Five Alameda's YouTube page. So you can go there to do it. Thank you all for your comments and your participation.
Yes.
I appreciate you all for participating in this learning lift. And I hope
we appreciate you, Shawn, for bringing everyone, these wonderful speakers together. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you for filling out your evaluation, which helps us so much know what other things we can bring these wonderful speakers back, and what other kinds of trainings are you interested that'll help you in your work. So we'll be sending that out shortly. And also we'll be sending one 3 months from now to see how much of this information has really helped you in your work, so we can really make sure what we're doing using public money is making a difference in your life and in the work that you do. Thank you so much, Shawn, and we'll say goodbye for now and look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe.